Hi, I'm Herb Frazier. I'm a Charleston-based writer, and I'm a journalist, and I'm co-author of Sleeping with the Ancestors: How I Followed the Footprints of Slavery. In this book, Joe McGill, my friend and co-author, we talk about his 14 years of traveling the country and sleeping in slave dwellings in the United States, because we believe that slave dwellings are important artifacts in order to tell the true narrative of the contributions of our ancestors and how they helped to develop this country. And also in this book, one of the things that most important things we do, we tell a lot of stories in the voices of in the voices of our ancestors, because when they were alive, they did not have the ability to share their stories to the extent that we can do now. So I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague Joseph McGill, who will tell you about the Slave Dwelling Project, and then I'll come back and tell you how we uh, developed this book and what some of the things that we hope to do in the future with Sleeping with the Ancestors. Joe?
Yes, I'm Joe McGill. I am co-author of the book Sleeping with the Ancestors: How I Followed the Footprints of Slavery. And it chronicles my activities of sleeping in slave dwellings. And the reason for sleeping in slave dwellings is to bring attention to these places. It's necessary. It was necessary back then, as it is now. What I learned in school about Black history, South Carolina history, United States history was incomplete. It did not include the real stories or the real histories of the people of whom I share my DNA. Uh, Fortunate for me, I became a park ranger at Fort Sumter, where the Civil War started. And because I became a park ranger at Fort Sumter while I was studying at South Carolina State University to become an English major, which I am, I accomplished that. But I started working for the National Park Service, Fort Sumter National Monument, and doing the research that I did for that job made me realize that some of those things that I was taught or was not taught uh, was relevant to history. And it showed me that what I was taught, that my enslaved ancestors were happy to be enslaved, the enslavers were benevolent to them, ran counter to the fact that it was a civil war necessary to end it all, because it was that civil war that the Confederates were using to continue the practice of enslaving my ancestors. So, in doing this research and having revealed to me that the history was not real, gave me an opportunity to, indeed stand in front of an audience at Fort Sumter and tell about the Civil War. At the same time, being a park ranger at Fort Sumter, I encountered Confederate reenactors who would try to recruit me to be a part of their ranks. And my knowledge and my research revealed that would be a crazy move for me to join Confederate reenactors who are reenacting the period that enslaved my ancestors. And they're reenacting an element of history, of war that was fought to keep them in that condition. So joining them was certainly not a wise thing to do. And then the movie Glory came out. And prior to the movie Glory coming out, the promotion for that movie prompted me to do more research, because that movie, Glory, was about Black soldiers in the Civil War serving for the Union during the Civil War. So, with that enthusiasm, I created a Civil War reenactment group right here in Charleston, South Carolina, the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Company I. We're still somewhat active, somewhat. There are a few of us still around, still put on the uniform. We'll do things maybe once or twice a year. In fact, in about 3 weeks, we'll be going to Morris Island And Morris Island, for those of you who are familiar with the movie Glory, is where that battle historically took place. So for the last few years, we've been going to Morris Island to celebrate that. And I think that Herb, that's a celebration of some sorts for Herb, but I'll let him talk about that. I am a Civil War reenactor. Uh, I come with that experience, that knowledge, but extracting from that those opportunities that I had as a Civil War reenactor, interacting with other Civil War reenactors, not just on the battlefield, shooting at each other, but after the crowd leaves, those opportunities to have campfire conversations, go from campfire to campfire, and talk to people who don't look and think like you. The only commonality that you really have is that hobby, that Civil War reenacting hobby, and these moments that you come together. So that I pulled an element out of that to apply to the slave dwelling project, because the slave dwelling project started as something simple, as sleeping in slave dwellings, because that act would indeed arouse curiosity, and it did. It worked. So my very first sleepover was at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. Herb and I were co-workers at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens. So he influenced the beginning of the slave dwelling project. So I there I started the slave dwelling project, first sleepover at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, and having that experience in with the initial intent of just doing this slave dwelling project, sleeping in slave dwellings for 1 year, and only in the state of South Carolina. Uh, Once it started, it was no stop. That genie could not be put back in the bottle. That bell could not be unrung. And now, 25 states and the District of Columbia, the slave dwelling project is still active. In 2014, this year we'll be doing our eighth conference, and we'll be doing our eighth conference in a northern state, the state of Pennsylvania, October 3rd through the 5th. And we may talk about more about that um, as we continue to have conversations about the book, Places We've Gone. Now, in the book, and Herb may talk more about this, there are elements of places, there are categories of places, I should say. And some of those places are directly involved or in conjunction with or relate to the Civil War. So, we can talk some about that. One such site is, of course, Fort Moultrie, one of our most recent sleepovers, and what that the role that played. And as far as the places Herb and I have gone together, because since the book has been published, Herb and I have gone to 12 states. Herb, can you
Yeah, we've
elaborate
been to
on
12 states.
it?
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, and some of these places have been directly related to the Civil War. I know Fort Moultrie jumps out at me right now. There are more. We've gone to some places where, Griffin, Georgia, for instance. A lot of these places were indeed most active leading up to the years of the Civil War. So a lot of the content of this book deals with that. So yeah, as I said, Herb Frazier was influential in launching the project. So I'll yield to him right now.
Well, thank you, Joe. Um, as Joe mentioned, he's been to 25 states and he's visited about 150 sites, and some of those sites he's been to more than once. So he's done more than 250 overnight stays in slave dwellings around the country. Now, I did not do nearly as many overnight stays with Joe. I think I've spent maybe a dozen nights at various sites around the country. But what I bring to the project as a journalist is my understanding of the connection between Low Country, South Carolina, and West Africa and the Caribbean. As a journalist, I've traveled there and reported on the contributions of our ancestors who were stolen from those locations and brought to South Carolina. And I've written and I've been a part of three other books. So I had that publishing background and writing background that that I brought to this subject. Uh, 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 at the 10th year, after a decade of traveling the country, sleeping in slave dwellings, Joe began to really get kind of antsy. He wanted to document what he had been doing. There had been two previous attempts to produce a book. University of Georgia Press, University of Virginia Press tried to collaborate with them, but for whatever reasons, those didn't pan out. So I decided that 2.5 years ago, roughly, to assist them in writing the book. And we produced this book was published a year ago this June, Sleeping with the Ancestors, a Hachette group, Hachette book group in New York. Um, One of the things that helped in putting this narrative together was in the early years of Joe's work, he was writing a 500-word blog that was placed on various websites. And as other people joined him, others also wrote about their experiences. So we took those blogs and then we started looking at some of the history of the sites, some of the enslaved people, some of the people who had been enslaved at those sites, and bringing forward their voices, because this is very important to in this narrative to start to tell the story from the perspective of those who were enslaved. The first part of the book, we talk about some of Joe's stays, but when he was by himself and as other people joined him. But then the book is then begin. We start to group these stories into subjects like state and federally owned parks that were built on former plantation sites where Joe spent the night. And we looked at the role that slavery played in the development of the nation's higher education system, because some of the colleges and universities where Joe went to, they had benefited from slavery. And then, of course, we have 12 US presidents who enslaved people, and 8 of them enslaved people while they were in the White House. And then in the book, we talk about the garden clubs in Natchez, Mississippi, where Joe has developed a Behind the Big House program. It takes visitors to some of these grand mansions in Natchez to visit and hear about the history of the slave dwellings behind these 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 um, these Natchez mansions. And then we have a section on family reunions. One of the things that surprised me in doing the research for this book was that the Black family reunion grew out of the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. The war and, of course, slavery severed the ties of Black families. And after the war, Black folks who were able to self emancipate themselves and go to free states, they started to look down south, and they ran newspaper ads to try to reconnect with the families that they had not seen since they fled the South. And in many cases, they were able to reconnect, and that out of that grew the family reunions that many Black families still practice today. Now, Joe mentioned that Magnolia Plantation and Gardens was the first place where he spent the night in a slave dwelling, which was Mother's Day weekend in 2010. uh, when Joe got up off that hard wooden floor of that 1850s era slave dwelling, he did not know where he was going when he started walking that morning. And he ended up in a cemetery. And he ended up in a cemetery that holds the remains of people who were enslaved at Magnolia. One of the questions we've done about uh, more than 30 of these talks around the country in 12 states, and many people want to know that when Joe sleeps in these cabins, does he see any ghosts? He didn't see any ghosts. But
Oh,
we do believe that the spirit of our ancestors have guided us in this research, just as the spirit of our ancestors guided Joe that morning when he got up off the floor of that cabin and went for that walk. And they guided him to that cemetery, which is a very important sacred space at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, which is near Charleston, South Carolina. And I'll end with this. This book was released in June of last year, and our publisher, Hachette Book Group in New York, is going to come out with a paperback edition of this book in January 2025. We're really, really excited about that, but we're very excited about the fact that this book will also, this paperback edition of Sleeping with the Ancestors, will include a teacher's guide which will be designed for middle school students. And we think it's very important that this book helps to tell the story of our ancestors, particularly aimed at those students in schools and in states and counties and cities where this book banning movement is trying to deny our students, Black students, white students, adults, a true narrative of how our ancestors built America. So, yes, we're very excited about that. Oh, and let me end with this. Joe, you mentioned Civil War. In the book, we tell the story of Goodwill Plantation near uh, Columbia, South Carolina. And it's a very fascinating history of how Goodwill was developed after the Civil War started. The South Carolina government ordered the rice planters along the Combahee River to relocate their enslaved workers who were growing rice along at the rice plantations along the Combahee, and they were moved inland to Columbia, near Columbia, to Goodwill, where they were growing rice, which had probably never been done before. So these Africans who were stolen from West Africa, where they knew that rice growing technique, because the English, this is an English colony, South Carolina, they didn't know how to grow rice. So they reached out and they stole people from West Africa, brought them to the lowlands of South Carolina to grow rice, which made the South Carolina colony wealthy during the colonial era, which that continued into the middle of the 19th century. And those Africans were brought to Goodwill, and where they built this water powered rice mill. So that's a fascinating story. And that, again, is one of the examples of how we think the ancestors guided us and placed before us these incredible stories that you will read in Sleeping with the Ancestors. Thank you.
yes, yes. Thank you, Herb. And while you were talking so eloquently about what's in the book, I did come up with some places that are directly related with the Civil War that the Slave Dwelling Project has gone to and uh, done its services. I think one that's really pertinent to this conversation is the Beauregard Kai's house in New Orleans, Louisiana. After the Civil War, Beauregard lived in New Orleans, and he lived in this house. But the builder of the house was an auctioneer, and of course, he auctioned people. So, the fact that the house was associated with Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard was interesting enough for me to want to sleep there. But I was more interested to sleep there because of the auctioneer and his roles that he played in uh, building that wealth, of building that desire for those enslavers to want to continue that way of life through a civil war. So Beauregard Kai's house is one place, and it's interesting also because there is where we had a conversation around a campfire about free labor. That free labor being the fact that those enslaved people weren't being paid. One gentleman disagreed, and his argument was that it was not free labor because the enslaver was clothing them, he was feeding them, he was housing them. Everything he said was true, but the timing was just bad for the moment. And the crowd got a little wanted to get physical, and I had to put it into that. I also stayed at Fort Monroe. Fort Monroe is that place where, when the Civil War started, the Union commanders did not know what to do with the enslaved people coming into their ranks. In fact, some of them would just send them on back to their owners. But what they found out was these owners were renting these people out to the Confederate Army, and the Confederate Army was using them to build forts, take care of horses. When they went into Fort Monroe, they did it differently. He held on to these people, and these people became contraband, spoils of war. So it all started right there with that movement, with these enslaved people coming into these Union lines seeking refuge. Um, so that was that. Also, there was some folks say, the first shot of the Civil War was Fort Sumter. At April 12th at 4:30 a.m., the first shot of the Civil War was shot from a mortar shell on James Island. A 10-inch mortar shell on James Island sailed a mile and a third over the harbor and exploded directly over Fort Sumter. That was a signal shot for all the other cannons to start firing. And Herb Frazier, here's a interesting tidbit, and that is they said that Edmund Ruffin pulled that lanyard on that first shot. Now that's debatable, but it. I have heard that said by some historians.
Well,
Um,
that's what Eric Larson writes about in his new book, Demons of Unrest. It's a fascinating read. I met Eric Larson recently here in Charleston and talked with him and interviewed him about this book. And if anybody has any doubt that slavery was not part of the reason for the Civil War, read this book. He lays it out and he uses the historical record in the words of the Confederates to say that yes, enslaving our ancestors and having that and having them as an important component of the Southern economy, and the fear of losing their work, their labor, their free labor to support the Southern economy, that was the thing that started that war. Now, I mean, if you can read the English language and if you know one and one is two, hey, there's no refuting it. I'll end it
yeah.
there.
Hey, hey, whatever language you read, I know this is international, but the fact is still the same. It's about slavery. It was about slavery. There are those who may want to counter that, want to push back on that, and talk about the economics of it all. But it still goes back to slavery because, and we talk about slavery in northern states, and slavery in northern states is what we're going to be talking about at the conference in October, because we're going to be stressing the fact that this slavery in northern states, although after the revolution, these northern states abolished slavery, they were still complicit in the fact that that's where the insurance companies were putting insurance on the enslaved people. That's where the banks were putting mortgages on enslaved people. That's where the shipbuilders were. That's where the ship owners were in those northern states. Those ships that were importing enslaved people into this nation. That's where the factories were adding value to the cotton that was being picked. So, I mean, they could talk about the economics of it, and that was a factor. But that economic was rooted in slavery and the futures thereof. Other places that I've gone. Some historians would say that the shot by John Brown in 1859 was that first shot, and then that attack on Harper's Ferry was that first shot of the Civil War. So I've gone to the place where John Brown slept prior to his raid on, um, on to Harper's Ferry. So, that's a relationship. If indeed you define the Civil War, that of that first shot being John Brown and that raid, I've had that privilege. I'm going to Camp Nelson next week. I'm going to Camp Nelson next week. They're having a Civil War weekend. It's not a reenactment. Reenactments are not that popular anymore since the death of the 9 people who were slain by Dylan Roof, and Herb Frazier may want to talk a little more about that. Um, so I'm going to Camp Nelson. I've gone to Pamplin Park in Virginia, Liberty House in Manassas, Virginia, Clifton. Clifton is interesting because when I go back to Philadelphia in October for the conference, I will be having a sleepover at Clifton. Clifton was the first northern state. For me, uh, slavery was defined as a plantation in the South when I graduated in 1979, because that's where my education left me, in that place. But slavery is more than that. I've learned since I've been on this journey. Slavery is urban slavery. Even in southern cities, slavery is the plantation. Slavery is also the urban slavery that existed in those places. And slavery is also slavery in these northern states. So I've gone to these northern states and I've applied what I do. Now, Clifton and the Civil War. Clifton was part of the Chew family in Philadelphia. Um, Mr. Chew was a lawyer, and he owned plantations. And because he owned plantations, uh, during the Civil War, he was playing both sides of the issue. This Northerner in Connecticut who was also a plantation owner, his plantations being in Maryland. So there's that. I've also gone to the site of Ulysses S. Grant in St. Louis, Missouri. Didn't do a sleepover there, just part of a symposium that they had going on. I've gone to Stratford. In fact, next month I'll be going to Stratford again. And Stratford is the birthplace of Robert E. Lee. So I'm looking forward to that. Today I had a conversation about Arlington House. There's a lot going on at the Arlington House right now. Uh, it was originally Lee's home, Robert E. Lee, and now it's what it is. It's the cemetery, National Cemetery, Arlington National Cemetery. It's known for that also. But it was once upon a time, Lee's home, Robert E. Lee's home. So we're negotiating a program that the slave dwelling project could come up to the Arlington House and make at least a conversation, if not the sleepover. There's a lot of bureaucracy there, so we gotta deal with that. So we'll take what we can get, and ultimately we want to sleep in the White House because that too has its connections to the Civil War. So we certainly want to do that. Abraham Lincoln was living in the White House when the Civil War started. James Buchanan lived in the White House when Abraham Lincoln was elected. So we want to, make those connections also, not only with the slave dwelling project, but the Civil War. Now, I know this is about the Civil War, and we've talked about that most, and that's what this is designed to do. But we must also consider that in 2026 will be the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. So the Slave Dwelling Project is committing a lot of its time to ensuring that in this commemoration, the voices of the Black folks of that period in history is also represented. We know that most of those people were enslaved at the time, but not all were. but we need to just be all inclusive and tell the whole story. We also want to encourage anyone from the indigenous community to do the same, to be as diligent in ensuring that the Native American voice is also represented in the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. So I will put a period right there.